I'm Scott Ebright, and I own a Jaguar S-Type 2005 year, and the fix that I'm about to show you is for the fuel flap door right here above the gas tank. And this may apply to any of the other Jaguars from, I'm not sure, maybe 2003 to 2006. It'll be up to you to determine if this is your same fuel flap door. But they are out of a beautiful car that the Jaguar is. They made a cheap plastic little latch that used to be connected to the door like that so that it would catch in the latch when it closed. But mine broke off right at the base, and I've been wasting a year looking on the internet for fixes for it, and short of rolling up duct tape or doing other stupid temporary fixes, it wasn't good enough for me. I wanted to do a permanent fix. You can no longer buy the parts in stock. There's just no other solution other than doing it yourself like I'm about to show you. So because this had broken off, I figured, how am I going to adhere it back to the flap door but in a strong way? So step one was you had to prepare it, and like I did, I used acetone and dripped it down. I used a wooden dowel like this, dipped it in a can of acetone so I could control it better than a big fat paintbrush. And I sort of dripped it around, and then I used a screwdriver and did some scraping. And the acetone isn't as thorough as a paint remover, but you don't want a big blob of hard to use paint remover. Acetone is thin and clear, so you can see every inch of the way you're doing it. But here's a very important step I forgot to tell you. Before you even begin to scratch paint, make sure that you score this location, the exact location of this plastic part, onto the flap door. Now I'm looking for the part here, and what you do is right here, I extended, I don't know if you can see it up close, there's a score line here and a score line there and a score line this way. So I put it down and I used a hard edge, a metal edge, and I think I used like the corner of a piece of sheet metal, a sharp little corner of an object like this actually, and I did a long straight gouge on the bottom, long straight gouge on the top, and then I put a gouge behind it and in front of it. So what I wound up with was like a tic-tac-toe board, but that little center rectangle area, you can't see it on the camera, but I can still see the faint lines. So that's my scoring to always keep this lined up throughout this whole process. So I've already removed paint remover off the bottom of this. I got a piece of sheet metal, nice and thin, pliable like this. Used a pair of tin snips after I drew out a pattern on a sheet of typing paper, and I drew out the pattern by measuring the edges and sides of this thing. And I wound up snipping out some pieces, which I have right here, and I've already bent them. So for instance, I cut out a long piece, well, about 1.25 inches it looks like, and I flared it out suddenly at the bottom. But you see, I made this one, there's already a hole in the latch, so I made it to go straight into there. That's one side. Then I cut out an opposite piece for the other side, and this one is a little skinnier because I wanted to fit inside of this with a little wiggle room, and it will sit down like that. So see how this is gonna, I'll go ahead and bolt it together. So I'm gonna drill the 2 holes on either side, so all 4 tabs, when I turn the camera back on, will be already mounted to the center latch. At this stage, the operation, I'm putting in the last bolt, but now I'm holding this last bolt in there with a pair of needle nose because I can't get my fingers in there. There, now it is all tightened up, both sides. Both of these side pieces were put in with the screw going through the hole. Nut inside on that one. And notice how conveniently that these little miniature bolts I didn't have to cut out the ends of them off. And that was all done again with this 1/32 by 3/8 inch. So number 8. But now, as you can see, this is almost this is the way it should have come from the manufacturer, to tell you the truth. It should have been a piece of metal in there, not plastic. But before you do any gluing and permanent resins, I'm going to tell you a warning. I did this already yesterday just as a test, and I knew I was on the right track. Take a piece of painter's tape, tape it down, tape it on the other sides as well, and now take it out to your car, and with it perfectly positioned where you think it's supposed to be inside your grid lines, do an experiment. Even if it means pushing the 3 tabs back on the hinge of the fuel flap, push it back in, and then make sure it goes into the latch perfectly. Once that all lines up, go in your car, push the release button on the gas, boop, this pops open, and if it does that, do it a couple times as insurance, then you know you got it made. That's the perfect alignment. And if you need to, my grid lines here are a little bit faint, but I already remarked them last night after I did this step. So that's my strong advice to you before you end a perfect project and have something that doesn't fit. It's time for the resin on the little switch product right here. So I'm going to show a good little close-up and do this in slow motion. Here's the side view with a little bracket. By the way, don't think you can get an easy way out and go to a hardware store and buy the pre-made corner braces. This is nowhere near the thickness of those gauge braces, and they're too thick and you can't bend them with your own fingers. These are real hard to bend, but you can bend them with your bare fingers, and that's essential when you're doing this whole fitting process. But there's what it looks like inside. Beautiful how all the nuts all wind up inside, because this is all going to be filled in solid, technically fiberglass resin. And the same thing you know, do the body work on your cars with. Notice how I've ground these all up, roughed them up and made sure all smooth surfaces are clean completely. I even used acetone on wiping them off, both the tops and bottoms. So this is the next process. Paint that with the resin, place this on it perfectly. Maybe put a little, I don't want to really put a weight on it. If you put a weight on it, you're going to squeeze out all the resin that's going to be bonding between this and the top part. And I had made a little tolerance when I made this whole thing to allow for like a 1/16 inch extra of thickness. So that's going to be crucial. So the next thing you're going to see me do, coat that, put this in it, and make sure it's perfectly centered. Now I'm going to kind of place it right down on the bare plastic of this part from the Jaguar. In case I didn't mention it earlier, I have a feeling that this fix would solve a lot of other cars' latches, gasoline fuel door latches, because if anything has to, sure, you could drill straight through this on the other side, then you'd have a massive body work job to do, smoothing the other side and sanding it down and then having to match the paint and everything else. Sounded like a lot of work for me, and I wasn't up to it. So I'd rather just do it all with relying on the adhesive bonding quality of good old fiberglass resin. Worked with this stuff for years. And the secret is make sure you don't put too much resin in it, or too much hardener. And if you don't get enough, you'll just have a gooey mess and you got to clean it and start over. Acetone is what you use to clean up with this stuff. So when your fingers get a little too sticky, wipe it off with acetone. Okay, now here goes the magic part. Setting this down perfectly where it belongs. First I'm going to dab it into this little swimming pool of resin. Make sure it's all covering all the parts. Now I'm ready. Put it down, dabbed into it. This is just boring to you at this point because you can't see the intricacy of what I'm doing, so I'm going to mess with this and have it setting, and then I'm going to let it dry. I'll probably let it dry overnight before I get in with the next layer and everything else, because with this thin layer, that'll be the time to go out and test it on my car to make sure I'm perfectly lined up. In the worst case scenario, if it's not lined up, I can wedge it and cut it with razor knives and figure out a way to finally get it to come back off, and then I'll just roughen it up and retreat it to do it the right placement. So here we are 24 hours later, and the casting resin has had a time to set all night long, and here it is. And I just roughly cut it out so it's going to fit over this roughly. I can tuck it all in, and it looks like I need a little overlap cut on this edge, so I'll do that right now. Well, no, it's about a full tablespoon. So I'm going to take it out and drizzle it carefully around, put a few drops down at a time around all the edges. And it's amazing with this stuff, once you get it soaked in the cloth, it just adheres to the surface, and the actual cloth becomes kind of invisible. And now I'm just going to make sure that this big puddle I put on top of that cloth doesn't get overweighted one side versus another, so I'm going to keep a check on it here as it sets up and cures and doesn't get all hover over to one side versus the other. This step shows what was done to the flap since the last installment, and you can see here around the edges I've used this drill motor with a grinding stone on the end of it to carefully grind down the edge very carefully so I didn't get too sloppy and go off the edges. But you see, the reason is, look at the plane of this flap. It's got a very thin plane, and there's actually this little beveled, you'll see about a ½ inch of slightly beveled thinner plastic. I had to make sure that the fiberglass resin out here on this outer ½ inch was not sticking up too high. I've ground it down by taking this thing and holding it down and grinding it, but I've got just a little bit more to do, because you see there's a little bit of a hump. The only reason I'm doing this on the outside edge is because there's a large oval ring mounted on the car body, so when this flap opens and closes, that's a rain seal, and I want to make sure it presses up against this part okay. But since the last installment, you'll see also, look at the resin inside this piece. It's filled completely with fiberglass resin, so all those nuts and bolts are neatly inside of there. It's a very solid piece now. Actually added a little bit of weight adding all that extra resin. Note that we did a final coat of paint, spray paint. It's close enough to the color, not a major clash. When the door opens and closes, no one's going to be looking at it. So I'm going to now get ready to start installing it on the hinge of the fuel door cover. We're going to get a close-up. The fuel door is now closed, but the real truth is going to be pushing the button in the car and see if that little guy pumps open. So hang on right now while we do that. Counting 1, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, and go. Now let's see if it opened. Gotta walk back around. Well, looks at that. Opens up. The fuel door has been fixed. And we're done. So I hope this helps all the Jag owners that are trying to get a fuel door corrected and fixed on their car.